Hello, this is Mo Al-Sumidai from Applied Clinical Trials, and I'm here to give you a brief explanation of the analysis conducted in this article. With the advent of big data comes the need to evaluate data in new and unfamiliar ways, and in this article we used computer-generated models to analyze the data, and the charts may initially seem confusing, however, they're quite intuitive after looking at them in more detail. So let's get started. In this article, we evaluated factors that were impacting eClinical software issues at sites. So what are sites' perceptions of their level of issues using software in clinical trials? And what we did is we leveraged a normative database, and we took unique respondents from 403 trials in a variety of different countries and different medical specialties, and we found that coordinators had more issues with software than investigators did. More training issues were also associated with having more software issues, and issues with CRAs also resulted in software problems. In addition, sites that had more concerns with using those software also were less likely to work with sponsors in future studies. So in the next few slides, we'll go through the actual data and explain to you what it actually means. Figure 1 shows us two histograms, one for the investigator and the other for the coordinator, when it came to software issue levels. As you can see here on the left-hand side of the x-axis, there were no issues with a ranking of 0 and 10 with a ranking of significant issues. So what we see here is the count of the amount of respondents for each category. And what's interesting here is that investigators generally, on average, tended to exhibit lower issues with software compared to coordinators, and that's delineated by the curve and the histogram here. As you can see, there's more weight around this histogram on the right where you have more issues, whereas the investigators, there tends to be less weight around the significant issues and more weight towards the no issues area. So again, this chart is saying that investigators had less issues with using software compared to coordinators. Figure 2 shows what we call a heat map, and heat maps are great at visualizing concentrations of data. As you can see here on the right hand side is a heat map key with darker areas as higher concentration of respondents, with lighter areas as lower concentrations of respondents. Here we evaluated the impact of software issues on setup and training issues, with, again here, 10 as significant issues, and with software issue levels, 10 being also significant issues. And as we take a look at the data clustering, we'll find that there's this cluster right here which suggests that lower issues with setup and training is also associated with lower issues with software. And as we can see, this trend goes downwards here, suggesting that the more issues we have with training is also associated with more issues with software. Figure 3 shows another heat map where we evaluated the issues with CRAs and monitors versus software issues. Again, 10 being significant, and here on the CRA issue level 10 also being significant. And what's particularly interesting about this data is it shows similar trends as the previous figure, but when we take a look at where the heat sort of dies off, it dies off around here, so we don't see as much heat as we go further beyond this area. Figure 4 shows also another heat map, but in this case we evaluated the likelihood that sites will work with sponsors in future studies, with 100 being 100% and 0 being 0% or unlikely. And again, software issues with 10 being significant software issues. And what's particularly interesting about this data is that, again, we see higher concentrations of data where sites who experience no or low issues are also very likely to work with sponsors in the future. And also we see this trend that sort of tapers off around this area of the y-axis on the software issue level. And lastly, figure 5 shows what we call a multi-dimensional bubble chart, which evaluates the percentage that a site will work with a sponsor in the future, issues with CRAs, and diversified by a heat map of software issue levels, with the darker air bubbles signifying higher issues with software and the lighter ones showing less issues with software. What's particularly interesting about this visualization is that as we move from left to right, the bubbles tend to get darker overall. And when we take a look at specifically, after we look at the level 6 with CRA issues, the bubbles significantly get darker, which signifies again that the more issues we have with CRAs, when it comes to this level, the more likely we will see higher software issues as represented by the darker bubbles. Now, what's also interesting about this is as we also move to the right, the weight of the data moves downwards, which signifies that the more issues we have with CRAs, the less sites are likely to work with sponsors. Nonetheless, when we actually look at combining the heat of the software issues in combination with those two other factors, we'll find that most of the bubbles center around here. So what is this really telling us? It's telling us that the issues with CRAs and monitors seems to have a higher impact on software level issues compared to sites wanting to work with sponsors in the future, as we see those circles move closer to the center and not all the way downwards.